All right, so now let's set up a quick workflow to get the data from our source. So we are talking about a product dimension, and then we want to bring this into our staging layer in our data warehouse. That means we load the data from a source, and then we want to place it into our staging schema in a table. And therefore, we first want to open up also our database management system, and this is in our case pgadmin. So therefore, we quickly open that up, and in here we now first want to create this table to set up the table structure. So again, once we open that up, we need to enter our password, and then we can click on servers and then on our server. In here we have our database. So we've called this previously Data Warehouse X. And then we have also the different schemas. And now if we open up our staging schema, we see that we open up the tables, and of course there are no tables there yet. We first need to create them. We can do that in all of the different database management systems. In here, we can, for example, simply right-click on tables and then select create and then table. Now, this will be our dim product. So therefore, we will call that also dim product. It will be our dimension product, and we can now add the columns. So first, we want to add the first column, and this column should be now our product primary key. The data type is therefore integer. We search for integer, and this will be, of course, the primary key. Therefore, we can check that box, and also we can set that this cannot be null. And now we also, of course, need to add the additional fields. So if we have forgotten what are the fields, we can also just have a look in the public schema in our table. So this was our products table in here. And in here we can open up the columns. So this is basically our source data. We suppose that this is the database where we are getting the data from. And then once we do that, we can retrieve it and maybe make some transformations and then load it into the next layers. So therefore, we want to use, in our case, also the same column names. This is fine. So for example, we can just write product ID. Then we have also the value, which is now a character, so a varchar. This is the best type for us. And now we also add the additional columns. And then last but not least, also the subcategory. And again, this is a character varchar. So this is how we can set up our table. And what we can do in here as well is we can also give some default values. So we can adjust the columns, and this is what we want to do with our primary key. What we want to do is click on this little button, edit row, and in here, since this is supposed to be a primary key, we can also give some default values. So we can go to constraints, can also make it a bit larger, and we want to, as the type, use identity. And this is just then generating automatically our identity, so a key. This is basically starting with 1. So we start with 1, and this should then increment with every additional row that is created with 1. And also this can be by default set. So if we make this setting, then automatically whenever there's a new row inserted, there will be an additional value increased. So this is now basically then our primary key, the surrogate key that we have created. And now with that all set up, we can just click on save, and now this table is saved. So we can now right click on this table, and we can also view the first 100 rows. And of course, the table is now existing, but it is still empty. So we see there's no data. And that's what we want to now set up, of course, in our ETL tool PDI. And therefore, let's go to PDI and set this up in the next lecture. Now that we've set up this table, Note also that after you have created that and you might not see it, you can also just right click on tables and then click on refresh, and then afterwards it should appear. But now we've seen the table is still empty, and we now want to set up this data ingestion. So we read the data from the source and then want to maybe make a few little transformations and then load this data into our first staging layer. And that's what we of course want to set up in Pentao. Therefore, let's go back to Spoon, and now we can of course remove all of these steps again. We don't need them anymore. And now we want to read the data from a table in a database. And therefore we can search for table. And in the category input, we find the step input table. So we drag it in the canvas, and now we can configure it by double clicking on it. And we can now see that in here we have the SQL query to query and read that data. But of course, first we need to set up a connection. And since we have not done that before, we can create a new connection. And we do that by just clicking on the new button. The first step that we need to do is we can give it a name. So in our case, we can say this is PostgreSQL connection, maybe 1. And now we need to enter all of the connection types, so all of the credentials. But before we do that, we also need to search for the correct connection type. In our case, this is Postgres, so we need to search for PostgreSQL, and now we need to enter all of these settings. But how can we do that? We need to find them out in our database. That's why let's go back to pgadmin, and we can now do that by right-clicking on the server, and in here we find properties. And then under these server properties, we find also this button connection. In our case, the host name is just a local host. So we copy that and paste it in here in the host name. Then also the database name is, in our case, we have to have a look again. This is called, we have called it Data Warehouse X. So we enter Data Warehouse X. And the port number we'll also see, in my case, it's 5432. So we can also copy that. And also we remember the username is Postgres. So we have the port number already set. And in here we enter Postgres. And of course we need to remember the password that we have set. So I also enter the password in here. And now, of course, we need to test this connection. So this is what we should always do when we set up a database connection. And we usually, in all of the ETL tools, we have something like a test button on which we can click. And we see that connection was successful. So this is great. We can click on OK. And we have now saved and created this connection that we can also reuse in later steps in this transformation. So therefore, now since we have set up the connection, we of course also want to enter the SQL code. What we can do is either write a command or some query ourselves, but we can also just click on Get SQL Statement. And then we can search for a specific table. So we can drop down these buttons, and we want to get now this from the products table. Therefore, we select our source table. And we double click on it and we say, yes, we want to include the field names. So we can have all of them in here. Of course, we can also just use a star to query them all, but it's in general more of a best practice to use also the column names. So this is what we have. And now we can just click on OK. Of course, we can also again click on preview, have a look at the first rows, and we see this looks all right. So we can again close it and click on OK. And now after we have set this up, we can again now output this into another table. So for example, we want to write this into the newly created table that also includes our surrogate key in our staging schema. And that's why we can now use a table output. So if we have still table in the search bar, we will quickly find also table output. We drag it in the canvas, and then we also can connect it by holding the shift key and dragging it onto the table output. Now again, double click, and the great thing is that this connection is now already inserted. So only we need to enter the schema. So the output table needs to be specified, and for that we need to enter the schema and the target name. So first click on browse to select our staging schema, and afterwards for the target table, of course we could again enter that manually, or just again click on browse, and then in our staging schema we find the dim product. And now if we have that set up, we can also go to database fields, and we have to check specify database fields, and we can now get fields. So now we have the mapping from this source, so the input, and where this should be written to. So of course product ID should be written also into the new field product ID. And like this, we can adjust that manually if, for example, the names are different in the source table than in the target table. And now, since we have set up this correctly, we can click on OK. And now what we can do is click on this little play button again to run this workflow. So we click on run. Of course, we need to save, and then we see that it does not work. And this is now because staging dim product does not exist. And what we need to do, we need to double click, and since there is a capital letter and this is now not case sensitive, we need to make it case sensitive by putting it into quotes. So we could have also just not have it written in capital letters in the database management system, but we can also just enclose it in these quotes, and like this it will be in all caps. And again, we check everything should be fine. So we now click again on OK, and again we want to quickly run it to see if it's working now. And indeed now it is working. So therefore let's head back into pgadmin to see how the data looks like now. And what we want to do first, we can close this little window, and we want to open up the query tool to write our queries manually. To do that, we go to the staging, and in here we find the table dim product. So we right click and open up the query tool to write a query. And now we can write select star from, and we want to now use again quotes, staging, and then dot the table name. This can be now dim product, and we can now again just click on the play button to see the data. And indeed, now we see that this data is now included, and we also have this primary key. So this is now really great because now we have also already our surrogate key. And the great thing is that always, even if we truncate the data, which we usually do after each ETL process, then this key will not start from 0 again, but it will start from where it has stopped last time. Let's also quickly demonstrate that. So we truncate and then the table name. So we truncate the table. Let's again click on play. And if we now query, we see that now it's empty. And if we now run this transformation again, we see, if we now query again, that now the key is starting not from 1, because this has been already used, and it's now incrementing and starting from the last value which has been used. So this is now really great, because this is now for us a true primary key, and the rows can now be simply also appended in the core layer. So this is now really great and exactly how we would like to have it. But now we also see that there are still some problems. The data doesn't look really clean, and we of course need to make adjustments, and that's why we now want to learn about the transformation steps. So we want to learn about them in the next lectures and then also, of course, implement it practically in our ETL tool. So that's what we are going to do in the next lectures. Now that we have seen how we can make a simple full load, we also want to have a quick demonstration on how we can make also a delta load. Remember that this is usually done for the fact tables, where we also have some delta column. So this is usually a transactional date or time, so some kind of timestamp. With that, we can just identify what is a new row in the source data that we haven't loaded before. And in our case, we just want to make it a bit simpler, so therefore we just want to use that delta load for our dimension table. And again, this is not usually done for the dimensions. Usually this is just done for the facts, but we will just use it as a simple example. And therefore, we just quickly want to have a look into pgadmin, because we want to now demonstrate this with this product table. And we want to assume that sometimes there will be new products added in the source system, and we only want to load the new data that we have not loaded before. And we want to use that product ID as our delta column. That means we want to save the maximum value of the product ID of the data that we have already loaded, so from our staging table. And then we, for example, save the value P748, and then we compare that and only load the values or the data rows where the product ID is larger than this maximum value. So this is basically the theory, and now we want to set this up in Spoon. So this again is a little bit tricky, but we will just make a quick demonstration of that. And don't worry, you don't need to remember every single step. This is just a quick practical demonstration. So therefore, let's see how we can set that up. We have mentioned we want to first save that maximum value in a variable. And we will set up an additional transformation step for that. Therefore, we just click on File and then afterwards on New Transformation. And now we can search for set variable. And then we can just drag in this variable in here. But now, what should be the value of this variable? We want to read that maximum value from our table. So therefore, we can just search for table input and also drag that in here. And if we now double click on the table input, we see that this connection is now not available anymore. And this is because we are now in a new transformation and we first need to share this connection that we have created previously in this staging workflow so that it can be easily reused also in other workflows. So of course, sometimes we don't want to have this, but we can do that in our case. So if we are now in the staging transformation, we can go to View, and in here we find database connection, and we can right click and we select share. And now if we go back and double click on input, we see that now the connection is inserted. And we want to now select, as we have mentioned, just the maximum value from the product ID from our staging table. So this is in our case how we will demonstrate it. And therefore we again use quotes, staging, and then dot dim product. And where condition we don't need. So this is what we want to have. Let's quickly have a preview and see if this works. So indeed, this is the maximum value. And this should be now stored in a variable. So therefore, we can now connect this with set variable. And now if we double click on the variable, we can use that maximum field from the table input. So this is the maximum, and store that now in our value. We can call it last load, for example. And then variable scope, we can use Java virtual machine, so it will be just available for also the other transformations. And now with that, we can just click on OK. And now we want to save this transformation so that we can reuse it in our job that we are going to create. So therefore, we just click on File, and then we want to save this as, and now we can, for example, just use the name, find last load. So we save it, and now we want to again create a new transformation. And now we want to get that variable that we have loaded and filter the data with that variable. Therefore, we search for get variable and drag it also in here. Now again, double click, and we can enter the name. This is not really important, so we can just, for example, write maximum, but now variable is important. And now if we want to get that variable, we need to call that with the dollar and then this curly bracket sign. This is how we always call the variables. So dollar, curly bracket, and then we have called that last load. Let's quickly check how we have called that. So we can go back and say set variable. So last load, this is how it was called. And therefore, again, curly brackets, and the type is in our case a string. So this is how it's supposed to be. And now we just click on OK, and this is now what we have. And now, of course, we also want to query the data, but we want to use this filter from the variable. And therefore, again, we now want to use a second table input. So we drag it and connect it also with our get variable. And now we can again just query all of the rows from the source table. So this will be in our case then public dot products is the correct table name. Let's check public dot products. That's correct. And now we want to indeed use this where condition to filter the data. And we want to filter this by the product ID. We can, in our case, so usually we should use then everything where this is now larger than our variable. But just to make it a little bit easier to quickly understand, we first want to set this to equal. And now what we can do is we can use this variable again by the dollar sign, curly bracket, and then we use the name last load. And since this is now a string, we also need to enclose that into these single quotes. And now if we want that this is converted into the value of the variable, we also need to check replace variables in script. And then we can click on OK. And now again, we want to save this file, and we can now say filter with variable. And we save it. And now if we try to execute this first query, we click on run. And then again, we go to the second transformation and also run that. We can now have a look at the preview, and indeed this is now so great because now we see that if we can also double click on it and click here on preview, we see that now only this maximum value has been queried. But of course, now we want to put this together into a job. And also we want to test it if we insert some additional data. And therefore, first we want to change it to only load what is now larger than our value. And then we can click on OK. And now we want to set this all together in a job. Therefore, we click on File, New, and we insert a new job. First, we want to start the job. This is what we always have to do in the beginning. And then we can use now some transformations that we have created before. We want to use 2, so we drag in 2 of those transformations. First, we say, we can give it a name. We can say set variable, and then we want to browse from a saved transformation, and we want to go and have a look. So in here we have saved our transformation, and therefore I just copy this path and again just paste it in here. And this is the location where we have saved those transformations that we can now use. Therefore, after I hit return, we can scroll down, and now we can see I have this find last load. So I select it, click on OK, and then this is connected to this one in here. Therefore, we also want to connect it with the start and do the same thing now for the second. So we want to use now here get and filter data, and we use now again the transformation from the data integration location. This is where it is saved. And in here we find now, if we scroll down, the filter with variable. We double click, click on OK, and again we can now connect that as well. And of course we could also output that data and write the results into an additional table, but we want to not make it too complicated now. So we want to quickly test it now by just inserting an additional value in our source data. So we can do that by just right-clicking on the products table, and we can say insert script. So this will just help us to add additional values. So we have here product ID, and this is now where we want to enter first with these single quotes this new value. And let's say we want to just enter a new product, and this is now 7 for, let's say, 750. And then the other values are not so important. We can just enter test. So now again, let's try to insert it. And if we now get all of these rows, so let's go to view, not only the first 100 rows, but all rows. And then we can see at the bottom that there is now this additional product in the source data. And now our ETL should only fetch this new data, because this has not been previously loaded. And therefore, let's see if our job can do that. So we can now just quickly simulate that with our two transformations, because in the job we have put them anyways here together. Therefore, let's quickly do that in the transformations so we can also quickly preview the data. First, we want to run this transformation. And then we can go to the next one, filter with variable, and we can also run it. And now if we have a look at the preview of the data, we see here is only this new row. So this is now pretty cool. And of course, I know this was now a little bit more complicated, but it was just supposed to be a quick example, a quick demonstration. And of course, this is also not set in stone how it should be done, but this was just an example of how it can be done and also how it works really well. So therefore, hope, even though it was a little bit more complicated, it was helpful in seeing how we can set up such a delta load to retrieve only that rows that have not been loaded before. Hope it was helpful, and see you in the next lecture.